Hello everyone, welcome to the Departamento Loratorum. My name is Max, and today I'd like to talk to you about Dawn of War. Released by Relic Entertainment in 2004, Warhammer 40,000 Dawn of War is a real-time strategy game that focuses on the Bloodraven Space Marine chapter, fighting on the world of Tartarus. While it wasn't the first video game set in the Warhammer 40k universe, it was considered by reviewers as well as fans of both RTS and Warhammer to be a great game, and it also introduced a lot of people to Games Workshop's sci-fi setting. One of those people was me. A few years after the game's release, one of my cousins told me about this game and its epic, if tactically unsound, introductory cutscene. I looked up that intro and was instantly hooked. I asked my parents for a copy of the game, and I loved it. And not only did I become obsessed with Dawn of War, beating it in all of its expansions, I became obsessed with Warhammer 40k as a setting, and I have been ever since. Without Dawn of War, I wouldn't be making these videos today. For a long time, a common recommendation for new fans was to do what I did and start with the Dawn of War series, as it provided an easily accessible introduction to the world of Warhammer 40k. In recent years, however, I've seen fewer people recommending it as a starting point. This is probably for a number of reasons. The age of the game for one, as it is now over 20 years old, and there have been newer games released in the past few years that show off the Warhammer 40k setting better for newcomers, such as Darktide and Space Marine 2. Another reason is that the Warhammer universe itself has moved on. Up until 8th edition, with the return of Guilliman and the dawn of the Era Indomitus, Warhammer 40k was stuck at the end of the 41st millennia. While there were lore changes and models that were added or removed, the broad strokes of the setting was still roughly the same from 2004 to 2017 when 8th edition was released. But, while the universe has evolved, it's still recognizably Warhammer, and people still recommend books from before 2017 to newcomers, like the Eisenhorn and Nightlords trilogies. So my goal, in this video, is to see if Dawn of War still serves as a good introduction to the setting. Does Dawn of War's lore still hold up in 2025? Now, as you can probably tell by my introduction and history with the game, I believe that the answer is yes, with some asterisks. But those asterisks, the things that have been changed or are just different from the Warhammer 40k that we know today, are the most interesting parts of the conversation to me, regardless of the final verdict. And, if you are a Warhammer 40k fan but you've never played Dawn of War, I hope that this video will convince you to give this classic a try, if for no other reason than to see what the setting was like 20 years ago. This video is going to be focusing solely on Dawn of War 1, as it itself is the introduction to the series. Any expansions or sequels will be covered in future videos. In this video, I'll be taking a look at the general setting and presentation, the portrayal of each faction and their units, and the overall story of the game. There will be spoilers, but I will be keeping those contained to the story section alone. This is also not going to be a full review of the game itself, although I do think that the game holds up and remains fun to play. If you want to see a more gameplay-focused review, I'd recommend the Thunderpsyker and Zaid videos. They're really great, and I will link them in the description below. For now, without any further ado, let's get started with a look at the setting and presentation. Dawn of War follows the Bloodraven's third company, led by Captain Gabriel Angelos and Librarian Isidore, being called to the planet Tartarus to help defend against an Ork invasion. The Bloodravens are a chapter invented by Relic and first introduced in this game, characterized in the manual as secretive and ritualistic, with a mostly unknown past, even to themselves. In response to this, the chapter has become obsessed with gathering knowledge, studying their enemies' tactics and abilities to plan for any eventuality, much like a strategy gamer. They also make heavy use of psychers, with many librarians being present in their ranks. The chapter's history and personality have been expanded since in subsequent media, but even in this first game they had a unique character, showing that they're not just a group of generic Space Marines. The character models for the Space Marines, as well as every other faction, are based on the tabletop models available at that time, in 3rd and very early 4th edition. With the recent Eldar updates, most of these models have since been removed or replaced with newer versions, with some exceptions, mostly in the vehicles for the various factions like the Rhinos, Land Raider, and Fire Prism. I would say that the vast majority of the models, as well as their upgrades, weapons, and equipment, are still recognizable as their modern equivalents, and still fit in with their modern faction's aesthetic. And I also believe that it should be expected that within 2 decades, new models will be released, and some of the designs will change, although that is of course subjective, and there are some models that are substantially different from their modern equivalent, such as the Chaos Raptors, some of the Ork vehicles, and some of the Space Marine units, which we'll be discussing more in depth later. Models may also have different squad sizes than what they have on the tabletop now, like Tactical Marines having a max squad size of 9, only reaching 10 with an attached character, unlike the normal squad size of 10 without an attached leader on the tabletop. I do remember this being weird even as a child, but it doesn't have much impact on the overall presentation and is more for gameplay balance reasons than anything. The brutality of the Warhammer universe is also on full display, with plenty of blood and unique kill animations if an enemy is defeated in melee. It's tempting to just ignore the rest of the battle and zoom in on a single fight to see what's going on. The music is also suitably fitting, sounding great and exactly what you'd expect for the universe. The buildings also fit in perfectly too, both with their factions and with the setting as a whole, which is impressive considering that most of them were designed just for this game. Even the quit screen is immersive, including quotes from within the universe. The battlegrounds on Tartarus are a mix of war-torn cities and temples, dark jungles and forests, hills, and eventually even some blasted wastelands. None of the backgrounds are amazing and impressive all on their own, but they all look nice, and are similar to terrain you might see on the tabletop and described in the lore. Nothing there distracts you from the main gameplay. At first, the battle for Tartarus simply seems to involve the Blood Ravens, assisted by the Planetary Defense Forces under Colonel Brahm, fighting against the Orks under War Boss Orkamungus. But, as the conflict unfolds, it becomes clear that not all is as it seems on Tartarus, and the Eldar of the Biel-Tan Craft World under Farseer Maka, Chaos Space Marines of the Alpha Legion under Chaos Lord Krull and the scheming sorcerer Sindri, and the Imperial Inquisition, represented by Inquisitor Mordecai Toth, are all revealed to be involved in the conflict. Gabriel must navigate all this while dealing with his own guilt over ordering that his home planet of Cyrene be destroyed by Exterminatus in order to end a rebellion, as well as with Isidore, who is falling prey to the darker side of the Blood Raven's quest for knowledge. This is a classic Warhammer plot setup and should be familiar to anyone who has read a few Black Library novels. While it may not be the most groundbreaking story ever told, it is executed very well and is enough to keep you invested, especially on a first playthrough. The story is also elevated by some truly phenomenal voice acting. Every character and unit fits the setting so well that even now, decades later, they're the voices I still hear when I think of Warhammer. And they're not all grimdark serious performances too, although those are also done very well. Relic doesn't forget how over-the-top and humorous Warhammer can be, especially with some of the Ork and Chaos units. And there's a reason that these games have spawned some memes that live on even to today. Let's now move into looking at the different armies and how they're portrayed. All of the factions in the game, the Space Marines, Orks, Eldar, Chaos, as well as the Imperial Guard and Inquisition, are portrayed well, in line with how you'd expect them to be. The Space Marines are honorable and obsessed with fighting the enemies of the Imperium, Chaos is villainous, scheming, and cruel. The Eldar are arrogant and enigmatic, but ultimately still trying to stop a greater evil. Of the main playable factions, we see the least from the Orks, mainly acting as a starter enemy for the first third of the game that is quickly pushed to the side, once other groups start to be introduced. They're not out of character, still being violent but sometimes humorous brutes, following the biggest and toughest Ork, but they're not really given much depth or focus outside of that. Their clan, presumably the Blood Axes based on the symbols and colors, is not mentioned but may actually be referenced in the story by them being willing to work with other factions and not just kill them on sight like most Orks would. This overall lack of focus is unfortunately not uncommon for Orks in Warhammer stories, with them often being used as starter villains, but if you wanted to see a more fun portrayal of them, I'd recommend checking out the expansions, especially Winter Assault with Gorguts. The Ork units are still fully recognizable, as their basic design principles have remained consistent over time. There are some differences, however, like the War Track no longer being sold, and the Killacan behaving more like a Death Dread, although this is an understandable change considering that they may have not wanted to have something so similar in name to a Dreadnought, considering that the Space Marines already use that unit. The looted Leman Russ is also interesting. While Orks looting vehicles has been a part of 40k for a long time and still works within the lore, it's likely that they'd use another Ork vehicle and not a stolen Imperial one now, as their roster has since expanded. But these are all nitpicks, and I don't think that anyone looking at the Dawn of War Ork roster would be confused seeing the modern Ork range. We also have some other Imperial units, playable only in the campaign in a few missions. These are Imperial Guardsmen, Leman Russ tanks, Colonel Brahm, and Inquisitor Toth, who we'll discuss more in the story section later. The game does go back and forth a bit on if the forces are Imperial Guard or Planetary Defense Forces, which are essentially just worse Imperial Guard devoted to the defense of their home planet, and this can get a bit confusing at times. Their overall portrayal is pretty standard, however, especially for Space Marine focused media. The infantry are weak, but come in large numbers and can be supported by some special weapons. The tanks are powerful, definitely the highlight of the roster. Colonel Brahm is also a fairly standard guard officer. He honestly looks more like a guard officer to me than the versions we get in the expansions, who look a little bit more weird. He mostly acts as a means of exposition, asking questions in order to fill the audience in on the story and lore. He also disappears past the halfway point without explanation. The game definitely could have handled its human characters way better. They feel like an afterthought. Granted, they aren't the focus, and nothing about them is exactly wrong, but they still feel a little bit unfinished, and an extra scene or line of dialogue or two would have gone a long way. The Eldar, on the other hand, are given a lot more care. They all look like the members of an ancient, advanced race that they're supposed to be, with highly specialized units and a lot of psychic powers, and they have a much more substantial presence in the story. All of their units are also still in the game, with some even using the same models, including the Aspect Warriors up until some very recent updates. And all of their units fit the Eldar aesthetic very well. There is a notable lack of some Aspect Warriors, especially for Biel-Tan, who are known to make heavy use of them, with only Howling Banshees, Dark Reapers, and Warp Spiders being present. But this is really more of a nitpick. Overall, I don't see the Eldar as having too many problems. They are mostly seen getting beaten up by the Space Marines and having their advice ignored, but unfortunately that isn't an uncommon position to see them in for Warhammer lore. Chaos is more of an interesting discussion. The Chaos units are still present and recognizable in modern 40k, although with demons such as Horrors and Bloodthirsters mixed in. This calls back to earlier editions, as the first time demons had their own unique codex was at the end of 4th edition in 2008. Prior to that, they, as well as all of the Chaos Space Marine legions and warbands, were all grouped together in the Chaos Space Marine Codex. This isn't immersion breaking in the context of modern 40k, as you would expect to see Chaos Space Marines fighting with demons then and now, and this is more of just an interesting piece of trivia. What's stranger, from a modern perspective, is the decision to use the Alpha Legion as the Chaos opponents in the campaign. Prior to the release of the Horus Heresy book Legion in 2008, the Alpha Legion was portrayed as focused on stealth, subterfuge, and scheming. But they were still a group of chaos-worshipping traitors, and this is how they act in Dawn of War. I don't want to spoil the book Legion if you are new and haven't read it, but it does introduce a lot more complexity to them, which is of course not present in the 2004 video game. They still work well and are definitely threatening villains, but a modern 40k player might be thrown by the lack of those additional complex elements of their characterization being absent and not even mentioned. Lord Bale is also weirdly stupid for a member of the Alpha Legion at any time, and it is strange that he got as far as he did at all, even with Sindri's help. Personally, this isn't really an issue for me, as I do think they still work well as villains in the game, and I also prefer the older depiction of the Alpha Legion myself. I think it gives them a little bit more freedom to work within stories. But some players may find it strange that they act more like the Black Legion or another generic warband than what we've come to expect from the Alpha Legion since. And let's finish up with the elephant in the room, the Space Marines. Most of you have probably been screaming this since the video started, but as this game was made before 8th edition, there is not a Primaris Marine in sight. This is, by far, the most substantial difference between this game and modern 40k. All of the Space Marine units are firstborn, and most of them, aside from the Land Raider, some of the Rhino variant vehicles, and the Tactical Marines, have since been replaced with their updated Primaris equivalent. Force Commander also stands out as something that doesn't exist at all in modern 40k, as while Gabriel Angelos' unit would just be called a Captain now, 3rd and 4th edition 40k had a unit called a Force Commander or just Commander, since game sizes used to be smaller, and it made less sense to have a Captain lead in a game with only 2 other squads. For some people, those who cannot stand the older Space Marine aesthetic, this may be an insurmountable difference. However, for me personally, this isn't that big of a deal. All of the firstborn units that have been replaced still look similar to their Primaris equivalent, especially from an overhead view. Enough that I don't think it would be too confusing for a new player, especially given that firstborn Marines are still mentioned and were in all Warhammer lore featuring Space Marines pre-2017. A newcomer to Warhammer 40k would have had the firstborn Primaris switch explained pretty early on, and, while I will go into the story more shortly, I don't think that replacing tactical squads with intercessors would change anything in it. The Blood Ravens are still portrayed as recognizably Space Marines, and if Dawn of War was released today unchanged except for the addition of Primaris, I don't think anyone would question it. Their units all still look very good and fitting for the Emperor's Angels of Death. This leads us neatly into the game's story. There will be spoilers, so if you don't want to see any, skip to here. We begin with the Blood Ravens dramatically arriving by drop pod to help save Colonel Brahm and his men from destruction, and then going on to cleanse the spaceport of Orks. In the aftermath of the battle, Brahm questions the company librarian, Isidore, on an exterminatus Gabriel performed recently on the planet of Cyrene, and is warned not to mention it around the captain. This is a great introduction, both to the plot and the setting as a whole. We get a taste of the brutality of the Imperium and the greater 40k universe, as well as learning about concepts like Psychers and Exterminatus. It also sets up some internal conflict for Gabriel, showing that Space Marines aren't just unthinking killing machines, as well as showing us what could be at stake if the Blood Ravens fail. The Blood Ravens then continue to fight the Orks, attacking one of their camps and helping defend an Imperial city and evacuating civilians from an Ork assault, before moving on to defeat Warboss Orkamungus and his Squigoth at the Ork encampment. But, as the conflict progresses, it becomes obvious to the player and the characters that not all is as it seems, culminating in the reveal that the Alpha Legion, headed by Lord Krull but obviously led from behind the scenes by the sorcerer Sindri, have been using the Orks to fight the Imperials for an unknown purpose. Cracks also begin to form in Gabriel and Isidore's relationship, with Gabriel haunted by his failure to save Cyrene, trying to ensure that Tartarus doesn't suffer the same fate, and Isidore wishing Gabriel would take more aggressive actions while also being psychically manipulated by Sindri. After the Orks are defeated, Inquisitor Toth arrives on Tartarus and orders a full evacuation due to an incoming warp storm that will leave the planet isolated. Gabriel, wanting to get to the bottom of what's going on, refuses and continues to investigate, discovering that the Eldar of the Bieltan craft world under Farseer Macha are also present. The Blood Ravens manage to defeat the Eldar, but Sindri uses this distraction to steal an artifact. Matcha tells Gabriel that this could be the undoing of this world, and that, due to the damages the Eldar have suffered, the Space Marines will need to defeat the forces of chaos. She also tells him that Toth knows far more about what's happening on Tartarus than he lets on. I really like how the Eldar are used, trying to stop chaos themselves and only helping the humans out of desperation after they're defeated. Really shows off their commitment to fighting chaos, as well as their arrogance, especially considering that Biel-Tan is an especially xenophobic craft world. They also provide a good difference of enemy to fight, contrasting against the brutal Orks and the tanky Chaos Space Marines. Toth, I feel, is a weak link in an otherwise solid story. He looks and somewhat acts like an Inquisitor, suspecting Gabriel to turn traitor due to his history, but he completely misses Isildur's very obvious corruption. I also never got the sense that he was as powerful as an Inquisitor is supposed to be. The game tells us that he can control any member of the Imperium, but the Blood Ravens are able to brush him off with no major consequences. He's also just a bit bland of a character, just existing to act suspicious and later supportive of Gabriel. He's not lore-breaking in any way, he still functions as an adequate, if flawed, introduction to and representation of the Inquisition. I just wish that he had more to do and a better presentation. If there ever was a remake, one of the biggest story changes I'd hope they'd make is to have his character be more engaging. I feel like there's a lot more they could have done with him. After finally confronting the Alpha Legion in person, Toth reveals to the Blood Ravens that Tartarus is home to the Maledictum, a stone containing a demon that was imprisoned on the planet by the Eldar thousands of years ago, which is the artifact the Alpha Legion were after. The demon has already begun corrupting Tartarus' remaining population, including Colonel Brahm, although this is only in the novelization, and he actually just disappears in the game with no explanation. With this revealed, Toth and the Blood Ravens decide to destroy the stone, attacking the Alpha Legion forces. Gabriel defeats Lord Bale after he is abandoned by Sindri, and Isildur, who has now fully succumbed to corruption, steals the Maledictum and joins the traitors. Gabriel, obviously upset by this betrayal, hunts down and defeats Isildur. In his last moments, Isildur realizes what a fool he was and begs for forgiveness, but Gabriel has no mercy for his old friend. I really like the fact that this game shows off how corruptive chaos can be, and the fact that they took the time to demonstrate not only Gabriel and Isildur's friendship, but also the growing cracks between the two to really help sell this moment. This to me is one of the actual highlights of the game, and is almost worth playing through just to see it. In the meantime, Sindri has used the Maledictum to ascend to demonhood, achieving his ultimate goal. Although given that the Maledictum is stated to hold a demon of Khorne, and Khorne's famous hatred of psychers and schemers, it is a little confusing as to why it would reward the sorcerer Sindri in this way. This is not a new complaint, I remember seeing people discuss this years ago, and there are some possible justifications. It could be that the demon was pleased with Sindri or just was bound and had no choice, or it could be that Sindri was actually consumed by the demon, as he's never mentioned again in the franchise. This is, at least to me, a relatively minor problem. There are enough justifications, and the character of Sindri and the scene itself are cool enough for me to just ignore it. But future expansions do continue to have a weird relationship with Khorne and psychers. The Blood Ravens and surviving Eldar manage to defeat Sindri, however, and have the Maledictum at their mercy. Ignoring Matcha's warnings, Gabriel uses Toth's demon hammer to destroy the Maledictum, accidentally releasing the demon within. The demon thanks Gabriel for freeing it, and turning Tartarus into a blood-soaked temple to the Khorne with all of the fighting, falling right into Sindri and the demon's plan. The demon allows the survivors to leave, but threatens to return later for Gabriel, who promises to be ready. While some may have problems with this ending and the human stupidity, I think that it is fitting. It wouldn't be Warhammer if everything ended happily, and this does set up later sequels, even if it took a while to follow up on the Maledictum specifically. Gabriel's actions and response are also very fitting for a Space Marine. Of course, he ignored the alien, even if it would have been smarter to listen. That's what most Space Marines would do. There might have been some cleaner ways to end the game, but overall I think it works fairly well, especially for the first game in the series. All in all, I think that the story is done fairly well. It provides an introduction to important factions and concepts in the setting, and is mostly, barring some confusing moments or minor lore breaches, completely comprehensible to someone who's only familiar with post-8th edition 40k. So again, yes, I do think Dawn of War holds up well to modern 40k lore. I think if you are a new player, or a veteran player who has somehow missed it, you should check it out. It's not only a good game, it's an important one in the context of introducing Warhammer 40k to a broader audience, and the medium of video gaming as well. Relic later went on to work on the first Space Marine video game after Dawn of War's success, so it's not an exaggeration to say that Space Marine 2 wouldn't exist without it. And I doubt that Creative Assembly would have taken on Total War Warhammer if Dawn of War hadn't proved that Warhammer strategy games can be massively successful. You can get the game and all of its expansions on Steam, and they go on sale often. Even if you dislike strategy games, I'd recommend you watch a Let's Play of it or even just the cutscenes. A channel called Big Dick Cheney has them all uploaded, I'll put a link to them below. There are novels based on the game, and I have read them, but I would not recommend them. The first one is pretty much a straight novelization of the game, but the later ones get kind of weird, and they're just not that great in general. I'd say playing a game yourself or just watching a Let's Play would be a better experience. I really do enjoy looking at older Warhammer lore and comparing it to what we have now. It's so interesting seeing how characters, concepts, and factions have changed and evolved over the years, and how, despite those changes, the broad strokes of the setting have remained remarkably consistent. I think that speaks to the skill and inventiveness of both the original and the modern designers of 40k, being able to make an engaging setting that has stood the test of time and continue to grow in popularity, and to expand and work within that setting and keep things fresh and exciting without making it unrecognizable, respectively. They deserve a ton of credit. It's honestly super impressive how well they've managed their setting, especially compared to a lot of other long-running franchises, as the original Dawn of War shows. So that's Dawn of War. I hope you enjoyed this. Please leave a like if you did, and let me know in the comments if you want to see me cover the other games in the series. I plan to do more general lore videos and minor Chaos Warband videos like the one I did for Emperor's Children soon, so subscribe if you'd like to see those. For now, thank you and have a great day. Bye.